Welcome to the Society for Marine Mammalogy's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar, which is hosted by SMM and Absolutely Smashing Mindful Conservation and sponsored by the Office of Naval Research. So this seminar will consist of a short presentation by Zeke Gonzalez, and then a panel discussion with our two other scientists, Annabelle Gong and Daniel Palacios. And then we'll have a Q&A. So I am Ashley Scarlett, and I will be your host, and I will also be your moderator, as well as Heather Penny over there. And so this webinar is about creating intentional inclusive space for LGBTQ plus scientists. And we'll just take it this away. Zeke, go ahead and start your presentation.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, etc., everyone. My name is Zeke Gonzalez. I am a queer scientist studying cichlid vision and behavior. But today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about creating a foundation for understanding some of the challenges faced by queer scientists and academics in general. And then we're going to talk a bit about some of these topics. So, to start off, I just want to say that each member of this panel has our own unique background and experience. We don't represent all queer people. We all come from a myriad of identities and backgrounds, and we don't represent all of them. We're just here to talk about our own experiences and the literature, and to use that as a foundation to build a conversation. So if you talk to another queer person who has a different view from us or has had a different experience, I just want to put out there that that is also valid, and that we want to be listening to people from all marginalized communities when they talk about their experiences, not just sort of focusing on a select experience or two and use those to guide our behaviors and our policies. So we've already said the word a few times, and so I know a lot of people, when I use this word, or will often ask, like, okay, but when you say queer, like, what does that refer to? And I think in order to identify what we mean when we say a queer scientist or a queer person, we have to address who isn't a queer person or a queer scientist. And so to sort of just blanket very broad terminology here, someone who isn't queer would be somebody who is straight, heterosexual, and or heteroromantic, or someone who is cisgender. And you can be one or both of these things. They're sort of separate. And a cisgendered person is someone whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with the gender they were assigned at birth. So that word gets thrown around a lot, and I think a lot of people have this instinctive reaction to words like straight and cisgender and queer and gay and lots of the other words we use to describe ourselves and our identity, but they are sort of just broad blanket terms that we use to describe ourselves. And it's important to remember that society, especially patriarchal societies, are cis heteronormative, which means it assumes that straight people and cisgender people are the norm or the default. And however, we know that that's not the case. And so to go back to the question of who are queer people, it's a really, really broad umbrella term that encompasses two other or three other also umbrella sort of categories or terminologies. The first is sexual orientation. This is something most people are probably familiar with the most. It's the idea of who you as a person are sexually attracted to. And then there's also romantic orientation. The two of those are often conflated, but they are separate for a lot of people. And that's the idea of the people you're romantically attracted to. And then there's also gender identity, which is it is exactly what it says on the tin. It is your personal gender identity, how you describe and define your own gender. And for sexual and romantic orientation, there are a ton of different sort of bubbles of communities and words that we use to describe ourselves, but some of the common ones are gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, and there are much more beyond that. And for gender identity, there are also many, many genders and many, many things outside of the binary, and sometimes within the binary too, of gender that society uses to describe us. And those people can identify as trans, non-binary, agender, genderqueer, and much more beyond that. We have this sort of very limited idea in our minds imposed by society that gender goes from like male to female, man to woman. And we know that that's not really the case, that there's much more outside of that that describes people. And as I've sort of been alluding to this whole time, these terms aren't as strict as we're often led to believe. And it's all about how queer people choose to identify and describe themselves. And as I've sort of been alluding to, being queer is more about not subscribing to cis heteronormative ideas about how people are than it is necessarily about strictly using certain terms to describe yourself or anything like that. And although some of these identities may look or sound new to some of us, there are many, many, many examples of queer people that have existed in many forms all throughout history and across the globe. There are lots of cultures where there aren't just two genders, the way that a lot of us have been raised to believe. There are a lot of places around the world where queer people are celebrated or also, yeah, lots of different, basically I'm just saying there's lots of iterations of this around the planet. And also, this is sort of the final point on this idea of the language of identity, is that language is always changing, and being flexible with changes in general society, and when you meet a new person, their preferred language to describe themselves is how we're respectful and accepting as people and also as greater society. And so briefly now I'm going to go over some of the research on queer people in STEM, which has been very low until about the mid-2000s, very, very, very few papers. And even now there are very few papers. Since I gave a version of this talk last year, I've only had to update the talk twice because there only have been 2 new papers that I've been able to find since I gave this talk last spring that described how queer people are affected by society, our mental or physical health, our satisfaction with jobs, and other discrimination that we face. So the field has grown for sure. There were 2 papers, right? But there's still a lot to learn about how we are affected by the paradigm of society. Like I mentioned, that cis heteronormative paradigm. And so in order to talk about the ways that queer people are affected, we have to talk about the idea of coming out. And so coming out, for those of you who may not have heard the expression before, is the idea of disclosing your non-cis heteronormative identity to other people, whether that's your family, your friends, people in your workplace. It's basically disclosing that part of your personhood. And it has actually been shown that coming out continuously, like I said, to these different groups over social media, at work, all of these different ways that we have to in order to feel accepted as ourselves, is shown to have negative mental health consequences, physical health detriments, and greatly increases stress. And this has been confirmed by multiple studies through the years. And then, of course, that raises the question then, okay, if coming out is so stressful, then who is out? And what we found is that more than 40% of queer scientists do not out themselves to colleagues. This paper was released in 2016. And it has a lot to do with some of the factors that I'm about to talk about, the reasons why people might choose not to come out, which in many cases, or in all cases, whether or not someone chooses to come out is always a valid and personal choice that is up to them entirely. And the challenges for out queer people in STEM that may explain why 60% of queer scientists don't come out in the workplace is because 60% of out queer people, it has been found in this survey or this study by Patridge et al. In 2014, that more than 60% of out queer people are uncomfortable in their department because of their identity, or are made to be uncomfortable because of their identity rather. And that despite what we often think of as liberal workplace, working at a research institution or someplace that is generally considered to be, really open and accepting, those who disclose queer identity are still often viewed as abrasive or disruptive. And 40% of queer academics feel pressure to not act too gay or to otherwise conform to what we call confirmation bias, which is a principle in psychology wherein a group is afraid to act in a certain way that it may confirm negative stereotypes about the groups to which they belong. And so this is a really common fear among all marginalized people, but it also affects queer academics as well, as we can see from this study. To get a little bit more specific on a study that was done specifically on queer chemists, people who work in chemistry across all branches of scientific fields, 44% reported exclusion, intimidation, and harassment at work because of their identity. And also more than 50% of queer people report experiencing queerphobic slurs, microaggressions, sexual harassment or assault, and violence, all above 50%. So these are all serious problems that have been shown to affect queer people in STEM. And this, of course, means that a lot of people, younger people, students, young professionals actually leave the STEM field. And we find that queer students leave STEM majors 7% more likely than their straight colleagues. And this percentage increases to 14% more if the student has had a research experience. Many of us are involved in research, and I'd like to believe that if a queer student has a research experience, that would then make them realize, oh, I love to do this. This is really fun. This is engaging. This engages my curiosity. But instead, we find those students actually leave more. And Binney, in a great 2011 paper, described or proposed a hypothesis that this, in part, is due to a lack of queer academics for younger students to model themselves after in a field. We hear so much about all these great scientists, and so little do we highlight queer scientists. And so, of course, that raises the question of what do we do? And at least when it comes to the idea of representation and understanding these issues so that we can address them, the goal is to intentionally build inclusive spaces. And so that is what our panel discussion today is going to be about. And all of us will be sharing some of our own personal experiences, answering questions, and also addressing some topics that we generated ahead of time in order to give everybody the tools that they need in order to actively and intentionally build spaces that are safe and that are safe places for queer scientists to work in, essentially. So yeah, without further ado, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Zeke, for that presentation. I think it gets better every time I see it, actually. We don't have any specific questions for you just yet, so I think we're going to jump right into our panel discussion. So the first thing we're going to do is get the other two panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Annabelle, and then Daniel, you can go, and then we'll get into our topics. So Annabelle, go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Annabelle Gong. I'm a master's student, second-year master's student now at the University of San Diego. I study shovel-nosed guitarfish and California bat ray and their movement patterns along the Southern California coast. And broadly, I specialize, I guess, in shark and ray movement ecology. And I'm also the co-host of a podcast called LGBTQ+ STEMcast. And then Daniel, take it away.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Palacios, and before I start with my intro, I did want to thank Zeke for that great presentation. I do feel that it covered a lot of the foundations for everyone, so sets like common language. And speaking of the language of identity, because I'm introducing myself and who I am, I identify as a cisgender gay male, and other aspects of that my identity that are relevant to me today is I'm 51 years old. I'm a native of Colombia, but I have been living in the United States for about 25 years. And I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute, and I lead a laboratory called the Whale Habitat Ecology and Telemetry Lab. So yeah, those are the components of my introduction, I think, that should cover who I am as a package.
Excellent. I think this is going to be a very informative, hopefully I'm going to learn something, panel. So our very first panel discussion topic I'm going to get to in 1 second, but if people have questions, you can stick them in the chat, and when I find an appropriate place to put them, I'll moderate them and compile them. I will then ask our panelists directly. If you have a specific question for a specific panelist, just say this question is for whoever, and then we'll kind of go from there. We'll sort of play it by ear. But we do have some discussion topics curated ahead of time because things we want to cover. So we're going to start with safety in the field, and we're going to start with Daniel, who is our most experienced panelist in the field so far.
Thank you. So yeah, we thought that the field work is a particular aspect of marine mammal science that maybe doesn't get discussed as much, in the sense that we know already, it's a well-known fact that women and minorities face disproportionate levels of sexual harassment, interpersonal violence, and that's across the board. But when you go into field situations, you have what you might consider a ratified environment. Just you're in remote areas for extended periods of time. And that just generally tends to open up situations and opportunities for some level, whether it's verbal or physical kinds of interpersonal violence. So it's important to recognize that as we send our people into the field, that we're going to be spending time in the field doing a study. Say I'm a graduate student and I have to go in the field for 2 or 3 months in the summer to study my species of interest, that we all recognize, both supervisors, crew leaders, employees, volunteers, interns, we're all subject to the potential for this kind of event happening, that we may have maybe the recipients of some level of interpersonal violence. But when we're talking about queer people, especially, that intersectionality of all those things that I just mentioned amplifies the potential for harassment even more. And I think that historically, obviously people who have some non-heteronormative orientation have experienced all kinds of microaggressions to, direct violent, brutal aggressions. So what do we do about the situation? How can we improve that? Well, we do have tools already to start moving in that direction of essentially in the way of training everyone across the board in our institutions. So some elements include, I'm just going to mention 3, having some level of understanding of bystander intervention. So there's a lot of resources online about bystander intervention, but that's something that everyone in society really needs to learn more about. I'm learning about it more. It takes practice. It's really something that we can only get better at with practice, because it's about developing certain languages, certain processes, little exercises that we can get better and better. So the more we practice them and rehearse them, the better we are at intervening at the right time in helping a colleague that may be facing some level of harassment. And crew leaders, especially, whether it's the PI of the project or the crew leader, or it may be the student who's leading the team. They all need to have some level of planning and training that before they go out in the field, to consider the contingencies for something like this to happen, because it happens all the time. And finally, obviously, at the institutional level, every organization should confront this, know that this is happening, and start intaking, absorbing this kind of resources that are there to minimize, mitigate, and prevent this kind of interpersonal violence.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, just from a more personal perspective, I feel like on the Marine side of things, there's a lot that goes into my thought process going into the field as like a non-binary, a gender non-conforming person. Society perceives me one way, but I want to see myself as another way. So that is especially jarring when we're going into the field in like bathing suits. That's a huge issue that I've had, thinking about like, what can I wear that makes me feel comfortable, but also for whatever reason, my mind goes to what makes other people comfortable. I think educating people on gender nonconformity and like, you know, people can wear what they want and it's not none of your business kind of thing is important, but also being able to surround myself with people who will stand up for me in those types of events is so important. And I think that's where like bystander intervention comes in especially well. So just getting educated on what problems people might face or what problems you might face and what to do about them is so important.
Absolutely. And I agree with everything everyone else has said. I don't have a ton of field experience. Most of my work is in the fish room in my lab. But just to share a couple of things that maybe people who aren't queer wouldn't think about when we're going into the field, the same way that Annabelle mentioned bathing suits being something that to many people is so ordinary and mundane, and yet it's something that some queer people have to think really hard about. How do I want to present? How can I safely present when I'm going into the field? There's something else that I'd just like to briefly mention as well, which is that I used to survey anglers all across Maryland as part of a study that I did. And something that would frequently happen when I would arrive at a site is that there would be small church gatherings at a lot of those docks. And when you see especially organized religion, in a place where you're trying to do work or even trying to speak with those people, and like you don't present in a gender conforming way, whether you're dressing maybe differently from the way people would expect based on how maybe you look, or whether you have mannerisms that you are afraid other people will identify you as being queer or othering you, that can be really stressful, and it can limit our ability to successfully do our job if we aren't surrounded, like Annabelle mentioned again, people who we feel confident will stand up for us, the way that Daniel described the bystander effect, and making sure people are trained in that sort of thing is very important. Because if I was there by myself and the group was like, a bunch of older people who are being very rowdy, I would just stay away from them entirely and not survey them, because I didn't want to risk, them seeing me like flip my hair in a certain way or see my painted fingernails and decide that they wanted to like chase me off or anything like that. And this has even happened on campus where, there will be protesters that have big signs that say things like God hates gays, or, repent your sins, going to like all these sorts of things that people are allowed to do. They can just walk onto your campus and do. And so even just walking to work some days, I get totally jarred, knocked out of my normal headspace. And these are things that most people don't even think about. You just walk by, but some of us, it makes us afraid for legitimate reasons. And that's something to keep in mind. That sort of level of what is mundane and what feels safe is something really important to consider, especially if you're looking out for queer scientists who are part of your team.
Yeah, so I think that some of elements have come up here that relate to the fact that when you are by yourself, obviously you are exposed to potential risks. So this gets to the question that Eric Archer just posted in the Q&A about what conditions, actions, attitudes have you found that make you feel safer in field conditions? And I would say obviously someone who's in a position of authority, leadership within a field crew has the best position to be looking out for that kind of thing. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to ensure that we feel protected and safe in every space that we are, especially in the field. So if we know that we are sending someone to a field situation where by the fact that they're going to be in small numbers or alone, then further considerations need to be taken in terms of how do we reinforce that, do we send more people, have a larger number of people, or recruit additional support from the local community, because a lot of the work that happens in the field, of course, can be in remote communities, as you just described with anglers. They may have different attitudes, different perceptions, and that can lead to a clash. So a lot of that is about preventing that with enough lead time. So accounting for that even before you go out into the field, and what can you do to mitigate some of those risks?
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And from a student perspective, it's so helpful when your mentors already do that mitigation preparation for you. Just an example, my master's advisor, who I just absolutely adore, we were going on an organized field trip to go snorkeling with some sharks. It was a field trip led by him, and already off the bat, he was saying, hey, just to let you know, like, if you need to change at the beach, there are gender inclusive bathrooms. So just feel free to like go change there. And already it eased a lot of anxiety, because it was like, oh, I don't have to think about which bathroom I'm going to change in, if anyone's going to be like looking at me while I change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really helpful if you're an organizer of an event or a mentor to someone, regardless of their identity, to just have those precautions planned out already for them.
Yeah, I think another big thing is acknowledging that we might be afraid of something, which is sort of like the bare, like bottom most level. But if you just acknowledge that you are aware that some people may be at greater risk in certain situations than others, or may have greater discomforts for whatever reason, already knowing that somebody else knows how I feel, it buoys me a little bit, makes me feel more secure. So that's personal for me. And I do think that's sort of like the most basal level. You should, if you are going to acknowledge it, also have something in place, or require some sort of training or get additional support, like Daniel said. But that sort of bottom level of just acknowledging that that there are challenges there is an important one, because it lets us know that and that you're going to take steps to make us feel safe and be sure that we're able to do our job right.
Maybe one final thing I have to add about this particular topic is that when we go into field situation, it's important to acknowledge that we are going to be occupying perhaps more intimate spaces, closer quarters, perhaps without all the levels of privacy that we are used to in our daily city living, or in our towns. So obviously, coming from a professional perspective, from an organization, for a long time we have known that there must be a lot of respect and boundaries professionally that have to do with physical or any level of abuse at any level, whether it's verbal or at the level of microaggressions all the way to physical. But when you go into the field, of course, that level of closeness and increase personal space sort of being, it makes the boundaries much more challenging, much more like you have to be ready to respond almost in the spot, because they're just happening there in your face. So again, anticipating that there's going to be that aspect of reduced personal space and an increase of potential conflict, and anticipating that and knowing how to respond to that is something that we explicitly all should consider when we're going out in the field. Not just take it for granted. Some people are naturally aware and are able to sort of navigate those different spaces as you move from, you know, being in a very remote area to being in a very crowded city. But some people don't have that ability, and it's important that everyone has some kind of basic level of formal understanding and formal training on that.
So a question that actually leads really nicely into what you were just saying is, Corinne asked, do you recommend particular resources for staff bystander training? Like, is there something available that people can do or that your organization can buy into to help?
My university here does offer bystander training. We have had a couple of trainings in this last year. And other than Googling, because that's what I was going to do, but at the end of the time, I'll just say, please Google it. I think there's a lot of resources online. Maybe my other co-panelists here have more specifics about resources. Meanwhile, I can look up the person that gave us that training. He was fantastic. He came from the outside. He was brought in by the university. So let me just quickly try and look it up.
Unfortunately, I don't have any online resources. I mean, yeah, we have university trainings here that involve LGBTQ plus inclusivity, anti-racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of like free courses online and stuff like that, I'm not really sure, because a lot of my, I guess, training comes from either living the identities that I live or researching them online and trying to figure out how I can be a better ally. So yeah.
Eric Archer just put something in the chat if anyone's interested, fieldworkinitiative.org. And so that's a resource that Eric has added for us. We have a question specifically for Zeke from Jamie. So they say, I think authenticity is really important for community building, and I'm interested in community-based research, but I've lived in a lot of places where groups of people were quite hostile to my existence. I wondered if anyone has strategies for trust building in communities. For example, Zeke, I'm interested in how you approach the anglers that you surveyed, or even just when speaking to the general public. So I think we could start with Zeke if you have anything to say, and then move through the panel.
That's a really good question. It also assumes that you're revisiting the same community multiple times, probably, because oftentimes it can be difficult to justify building, a community relationship with a group that maybe you'll visit once and then never again. But I think that a lot of this could come down to not even necessarily like queer outreach, but scientific outreach. If a group is more familiar with you and your lab, they're much more likely to view you as people rather than see somebody who they don't know, who does not conform to what they think a person should look like or act like, and then behave the way that society has trained them to behave, however that may be in any given group. With the anglers, to be quite honest, there were some groups that I just didn't approach at all, because especially if it was mostly men, there's very much can be a mentality that can build up around that sort of confrontation that I just didn't want to risk. But with other groups, I would go up and just introduce myself and basically act normal, just say like, I'm here from the University of Maryland, I'm collecting some data about fish. I'd love to know if you all would like to answer a few questions. It's sort of like a game show, and sort of just like pose myself in a very hopefully relatable way, act normal, and take the focus off of me and onto what I'm doing. That was normally something that made me feel comfortable, but I don't have any like strong, great advice, but hopefully maybe Daniel or Annabelle might.
I haven't done a whole lot of like outreach to like face-to-face. I think a lot of my outreach is online and to people who want to listen. But if I were faced with that kind of conversation, I think I would try to meet people where they're at. And yeah, I think always acting a little natural and pretending like nothing's wrong until things become more apparent is always a good strategy.
Yeah, I don't have anything else. I think what you said was spot on, Zeke.
Okay, so we actually have two questions, one from the Facebook Live and one in our Q&A that are related. So I'm going to read them both, but they're, I think, very similar. What do you recommend for those of us doing research outside of the North American context, where many of the locations / research teams we work with do not create this safe space for NB/LGBTQIA+? In some cases, it's illegal and unsafe. How can we create safe places for ourselves in these situations? And then there's also a question from the Facebook Live, which was recently there was an academic conference on the mainland of Malaysia where it's illegal to be LGBTQ+, but concerns from the community were pretty much ignored. And what should organizations do when it comes to meeting planning to make sure LGBTQ spaces are safe? So those are both two very similar, slightly different questions. Basically, what can organizations do and what do we expect from our scientists when they have to go places where it's illegal or very unsafe to be LGBTQ+.
That's a really difficult one. And is not just for necessarily field situations, but in our personal lives. It is well known that certain regions in a country or certain countries are very unfriendly toward queer people. And, you know, the basic recommendations is avoid going there. You know, the chances, the risk of some level of violence is high, or, you know, try to prevent as much, but, you know that you're already going to be exposed to higher risk. So unfortunately, at that level, what we have to think about is just kind of like the spectrum where humanity and our modern culture is in terms of our perceptions and understanding and attitude toward the full spectrum of sexual orientation. Let's just to put it some way, where obviously society has moved along a path from, you know, 10, 15, 20, 50 years and so forth ago. So that's obviously a path that those cultures have to move, and that obviously takes time. So I don't know that there's any better answer from my perspective about what to do in those situations, except, of course, to take every precaution to ensure your safety, even at the expense of having to essentially not be yourself and try to sort of play low key, low level, because obviously your safety is primary.
Yeah, I agree with you, Daniel. This question kind of hits home for me. My family is from Malaysia, so I haven't seen them since I cut my hair, which was when I got into college, basically. So it's definitely a tough situation where, you know, I can take all the precautions I can, but it's a balance between wanting to see my loved ones and risking the unknown, basically. Obviously, the culture of these countries is a lot different than what the government says, but the law is the law in a lot of places, and a lot of people abide to that law. But I mean, yeah, it's definitely a difficult question to answer, because it's like, obviously, for the sake of like a professional conference, you have the choice not to go. You have the choice to just be surrounded by the people who are at the conference, who are usually people from all over the world. So not really people who you would expect to be kind of with that certain policy or law. But when it comes to like just visiting a place or living in that space, for example, if you were to do research outside of the country in a different area where that laws like that are existent, it's definitely a gamble. You don't really know unless you talk to the locals there, or you surround yourself with certain locals who have the same values as you, I guess. But yeah.
And I think it's important to note that people who are cisgender, heteronormative, they don't have to think about these things. If a conference is in a place where these things are illegal, they don't even need to know. They should, but they, for their own person, they don't need to know. And I think this leads very nicely into our next topic, which is actively unlearning and then growing with compassion. So I think we'll start with Daniel again.
All right. Yeah, and what does that mean? Unlearning and growing with compassion. What I can tell you is that just as you, Heather, mentioned now that people who are heteronormative don't even have to worry about certain additional considerations of the spaces that we find ourselves every day, that us queer people deal with all the time. To me, it's very, very important to recognize that for us, our entire life has been one of being under that level of stress or fear, but especially one that is well known as shame. The reason is that even going to a very young age of 3, 4, you already know that there's something that, according to what you're being told by the outside, is wrong, that something is fundamentally wrong with you. And that's what all of us queer people grow up with throughout our lifetimes. Even, today we have parents that are completely accepting, completely loving, completely supportive of their queer children. The greater society is not there yet. It's moving in that direction, but it's not there yet. So we receive all these messages constantly from that young age. So it's well known within this psychological field that part of our human experience is to experience some level of wounding. But when we're talking about queer people, we have that very particular aspect of a deep wounding that goes back all the way to our early lives that essentially creates a number of issues, psychological issues, that we have to overcome throughout our lifetime, and that lead us to, so we have to some way approach, and that healing can be challenging. And that's part of the reason why a lot of queer people have serious psychological issues, because we have to overcome that lifetime of messaging, of conditioning about that is constantly telling us there's something inherently wrong with us, that creates deep shame in us. So how do we heal that? And that, to me, is the answer to my personal answer to Heather's question of being more compassionate, because that really is the path to self-acceptance, self-loving. And only then, when I can do that to myself, am I able to avoid spreading that hate that we have experienced throughout our lifetime, and essentially projecting something else that has to come from within, that we have to process and overcome, which is that self-love. So it's very personal, of course. This is a very personal view, and that's just an initial response to the question. So I'll just let my other panelists speak now, but I did want to insert that very specific history that as queer people we have, because the general public may not necessarily be aware of that. Thank you.
Not to skip over Annabelle, did you?
Oh no, please go ahead. I'm still trying to formulate my thoughts.
Okay. So I want to harken back really quickly to something that was in my introduction, which is that a lot of queer people, we really fear being labeled as disruptive, or being viewed as pushy, or breaking norms. And so this sort of addresses a lot of the previous questions, but Don't wait for, if you hear something like, let's say you're on a panel and they're like, oh, let's go to this place to have the conference, or you hear like, oh, we're going to send this person to this potentially dangerous field. This sort of addresses everything. Don't wait for a queer person to then have an issue with it. Try to identify those issues ahead of time and sort of speak up about them, so that we then don't have to, if you stop it at the top, it doesn't have to go to the bottom. And so that sort of speaks to I have actually three sort of ways that we can create inclusive spaces every day. These are very basal often, but they can have a really big effect when enough people in especially a working community do them. And the first is normalizing pronouns, introducing yourself with them, use them in your email signature and on Zoom, put them on your name tags, encourage others to do it when you see that they're not. And that's one very easy way that you can help make a space more queer friendly and more inclusive. The second I already mentioned is speaking up. When you hear dismissive, homophobic, transphobic, or otherwise sort of bigoted language or rhetoric, call it out and correct it. Don't force the queer person in the group. Let's say, I'm talking with a bunch of scientists at happy hour. If somebody says something in that setting, I'm probably, especially depending on if they're like, let's say all professors, if somebody says something dismissive about me or about queer people in general, I'm probably not going to speak up and say something. I'm a student. I'm not in a position where that would be good for me. But if somebody else does, then I can feel like, okay, that person has my back. And especially if other people in that group then agree, like, yeah, that's not right. You shouldn't have said that. We should say this instead to be respectful. Then that's a huge improvement on ways that you can affect culture over time. And the last one, sorry, I'm just rambling at this point, but just to touch on this last way that we can create an inclusive space every day is to practice mindfulness. Do your research, try to shed the cis heteronormative expectations that we've all been raised and instilled with, and engage with people no matter what their identity is. And that, especially for scientists, which is like it's a hugely diverse and, oh my God, we cross fields a lot. What's that called? Intersectional, thank you. It's a hugely intersectional field. We're always working with scientists from other places who have other specialties. And it's just one more facet to bringing in new perspectives. I saw a great talk at I think it was ABS, the Animal Behavior Society conference, from a non-binary scientist who was describing how thinking outside of human gender expectations has actually helped them to make huge advances in learning about amphibian reproduction and development. And so that's just one very simple, specific example of how engaging with people across fields and across identities can help us gain new appreciations for the world around us and the science of it, which is really what we all want to do, right? So sorry that went long, but those are my three pieces of advice for every day creating an inclusive space. Annabelle, did you have something?
I just wanted to make a little caveat to the pronoun suggestion. Although, I think it's really great that people are, especially cisgender people, are putting their pronouns in their bios, their Zoom tags, email signatures. It's also a safety issue for a lot of trans people now, because a lot of cis folks have taken, with good intention, slowly started to pressure a lot of trans folks to put their pronouns in their bio if they're not out, if they're not comfortable publicizing their pronouns, stuff like that. So I would make it more of a personal thing. If you know the person and you know their pronouns and you know that they're comfortable using their pronouns in public space, to encourage them instead of encouraging people you may not know, because you never know their situation, stuff like that. In terms of unlearning and leading with compassion, I think your last point on doing your own research is super important, especially from a queer lens. I do a lot of the outreach that I do is for queer advocacy, non-binary advocacy, stuff like that. But it's really emotionally taxing for me. And believe that both of you can probably say the same. It's really emotionally taxing to educate people on the identities that you hold, because usually people turn to you, ask you questions, stuff like that. So I would always say, do your research first, talk with other people first about subjects, because chances are the people that you want to ask are really, really tired. I mean, my existence is something that I have to advocate for every day. And the less people that I have to educate because they've already done their research online and they just have little questions and stuff, the less tired I am. So that's my suggestion. And honestly, it's okay to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Everybody has those days. But the point that I'm trying to get is, as long as you're trying, as long as you have good intentions, I am all for just messing up and trying your best and doing it over again.
Yeah, those are really good points. I wanted to follow up on something that Zeke said about being mindful. And mindfulness really is about observing what we're doing almost from the outside and every moment. But at the same time, I wanted to say also don't overthink it. And this gets to the question that we have by Natalie Van Broekellen, where she's asking about us as cisgender hetero female, and we're to speak out about something that she thinks affects her queer students. Is she overstepping by assuming that these things would be an issue? So it's, first of all, one thing I want to say is that over the last decade, we have had almost an explosion in terms of all these various identities that we're finally coming to understand. It's really about increasing our understanding. So even as a queer person, to me has been quite a learning curve about learning all these terminologies, both as social science, psychological sciences, and queer people kind of like come to sort of where we are today. So obviously for people that may not be experiencing any of this, let's just call heteronormative people, it's understandable. It's a bewildering field to try and understand these changing terminologies and pronouns and that kind of thing. But fortunately, as Annabelle said, there's a lot of resources online. So and a lot of people have posted this very same questions about, am I overstepping? Am I assuming something? And that's where I'm trying to get at with the overthinking, in that it really is about having a compassionate connection with somebody else. So it's less about getting it right every time and worrying that maybe I did something wrong, because we all make missteps all the time. But it's about that mindfulness again, about acknowledging what's happening in the moment and just saying something in the moment. For example, I may misgender someone accidentally, and I just stop myself and ask, or if I know that I misgender someone, I apologize and say, I apologize for the misgendering, and then move on. Just kind of like, we just have to move on, and, everybody understands that we can make mistakes. And that's part of the mindfulness process. It's just acknowledging it and moving on. But yeah, I just really finally want to reinforce what Annabelle said, that fortunately there's so many resources online these days. All you have to do is just type a couple of keywords that will give you the basics, so that at least, as Annabelle said, some people are just extremely emotionally tired of advocating for who they are every day. That as well-intentioned as somebody is, it would be a huge emotional burden to come into their office or the space and say, well, tell me everything about transgender people or something like that. But if you have a very specific question, by all means, I think that the best, if you have a specific question, again, it's about the mindfulness. It is coming up, go up to the person and ask them, if anybody has any question, come to me and ask them. I'm completely open, completely happy to address those questions. But ideally, most people will have done at least some level of research about some of those overarching questions that are already well understood out there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Daniel. And just to go back to Natalie's question really quick, I do believe that like in really specific localized issues like this, where you see something happen or something is consistently happening to a group of students or to a student, my first initial reaction would be to talk to the student who is victim to these actions directly and see what you can do to help them. Because, you know, you can assume all you want about like what a person wants, but maybe the student doesn't find it a problem and they're okay with it, or maybe they want you to do something about it but are too scared to approach you. I know that it really means a lot to me when my mentors or my peers see that I'm going through some sort of discrimination or microaggression, and they approach me afterwards and, you know, check in with me, ask if I'm okay, ask if there's anything that I can do or that they can do for me the next time that it happens, or following up on this action. For example, when I get misgendered a lot, I usually don't say anything, but after some conversations with my friends who've checked in with me afterwards, they now know to correct a certain particular person's misgendering to me, even when I'm not around, which should be a standard thing, but it's different for everyone. So having that conversation is always important.
So our next topic is actually on aspects of spirituality and its connection to mindfulness, which we've kind of been touching on for the last little bit because these things are all connected. But we do have one other question first from Eric again. And they say, I think the issue of heteronormative privilege is super important because it describes the blind spots for those of us not in the queer community who would like to be good allies. Are there other examples of privilege that we might not think about but should be aware of? So we'll get into the mindfulness thing in a second, but I just wanted to, I think that's a good question. And so we should, if anyone has anything there. We can think about it, and if it comes up, we can.
Heather, I would appreciate if you repeat the question.
Oh.
It's not quite sinking in for me.
Are there other examples of privilege from that we should be aware of that we might not think about?
Yeah,
for
maybe.
me, do you want to go first, Daniel?
No, I was just gonna say I'm not coming up with anything. It's one of those things that sometimes you have to like dig deep to like, oh yeah, that comes up. So right now it's not coming up.
I think for me personally, I like to approach my advocacy from an intersectional kind of lens. You know, I can never isolate my queerness as just its own thing and just treat it as its own thing, because I am also Asian American. I'm also like from a upper middle class family from like the Bay Area. All these different sort of things makes my lived experience. And I think acknowledging, you know, your class, your ability, your gender, your sexuality, your race, your religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all as this one holistic being is really, really important. And so like categorizing privilege is really hard when you think about it, because it's so nuanced, you know, because in some identities, I really hold a lot of privilege, for example, my class, but in other aspects, I don't hold privilege, such as my queer non-binary identity. So I think really exploring introspectively who you are as a person and like doing kind of a mind exercise. There's this really awesome exercise that I've done in classes. It's called like an identity tree, where you basically draw a tree and you, on the branches of this tree and the leaves of this tree, you write out identities that you hold that are visible to others. So for example, my queer identity is very visible. I think I'm very, like, appearance wise, I think I would be very visibly queer. I'm also Asian, just stuff like that. And then in the roots of this tree, you write down identities that are not visible to society. So that would be stuff like my class, my upbringing, stories that you can't see from just looking at me. And so I think that's a really great thought exercise to kind of start your journey exploring your privilege and oppression.
Yeah, and obviously I think this is a really, really big topic, right? Like we could go on and on about how intersections of different privilege sort of overlap and where they don't. But to Eric's question, because like Daniel, I was struggling to come up with one like sort of on the spot, especially because
you come up with one, so I'll go after you.
So I actually Googled it, and I found an article that literally says 30 examples of heterosexual privilege. I don't agree with all of them, but it is really simply, I mean, I can literally just read like the top three. Receiving public recognition and some support for an intimate relationship. For example, congratulations for an engagement. That's something a queer person might not be comfortable or able to disclose. And that doesn't just depend on them, that also depends on their partner. If you have a partner who's like, I can't be out at work, we need to keep this private to just our close friends and family, or whatever the case may be. That's more nuanced to that than I would have even thought. But expressing affection in social situations, not expecting hostile, violent reactions from others, is something we've already touched on. Learning about romance and relationships from fictional movies and television shows, having role models of your gender and sexual orientation. And that's just, like I said, I literally cherry picked like a few that I agree with, like right off the top of my head. And that leads back to something that I think Annabelle and Daniel also especially talked about on the last question, which was doing a little bit of research and thinking about it critically, which even just by asking the question demonstrates the desire to do that. So that's another thing that, you know, we can all do, is examine the ways that we have privilege and try to think about those critically.
There is one aspect of privilege that just came up for me that is actually pretty major, I think. And it's basically the other extreme. I think Annabelle beautifully illustrated an exercise that I would actually like to incorporate into my practices, but with your tree that you described. And I would like to revisit that. I don't know if you can verbalize or articulate that in some written way so that I can incorporate it into what I do. I think it's a wonderful idea. But what I wanted to cover is the opposite extreme of that. And because today is LGBT and STEM Day, obviously what we all have in common here is that we are in the sciences area, marine sciences specifically. And it's the recognition, this is a huge privilege, but it's the recognition that the science that we have been practicing in the last several decades, you know, what we might call modern science, essentially, it's all a product of colonialism, of European science and how that is done. And that is huge because it's not necessarily just how it impacts queer people. Again, it's all about intersectionality of different, but how science is done in the world, around the world. And the fact that the origins of that is all based on a white male view of the world and how they determined what science should be like. And that's what we're doing today. So as you come up through the pipeline of high school, undergraduate education, graduate education, and then into the field, there is a constant level of barriers for someone who does not come from that privilege of being raised in a white, cisgendered, sort of European vision of the world, and or anybody who has not been indoctrinated and adopted those practices as themselves. But again, I just wanted to get to that level of privilege, and the fact that for queer people is yet another of many aspects that we have to adopt, because that's a prevailing view of what science should be today.
That was a very powerful answer, Daniel. I hadn't even thought of that. We have two comments actually from Facebook. One of them is just stumbled upon this webinar and ended up listening. Thank you for the awareness that you've just raised. Congrats. And then another one is, I love your idea, Annabelle. This is talking about the identity tree, and they're going to be drawing an identity tree this afternoon for themselves. Okay, so thank you for those comments on Facebook. We're going to move on to the next topic. I do have a couple other questions kind of in the pipe, but I'm going to wait until I find a place to put them in. So we're going to talk about aspects of spirituality and connection to mindfulness, if anybody has anything specific to say there.
I do. I don't know if my other panelists want to go first, but otherwise I can launch into that.
Go ahead. I'll go after you.
So yeah, we're talking a lot about personal, our personal side, and it's interesting because it's opening up. But there's this really fantastic book called The Velvet Glove, I believe, which is mostly psychological studies on gay men that cover a lot of what I just mentioned about the internalized shame that we grow up with for most of our lives, and the path forward to being more compassionate and all that self-love is by being authentic. That is the key word, is developing authenticity, which means being vulnerable. So the connection here is that accepting some of these aspects of spirituality and so forth, that is not something that, again, going back to the view of the world of science and how it should be done, the aspect of spirituality is not something that we discuss with our colleagues in the hallway or at a conference or anything like that. But because the healing path to become more authentic involves a lot of introspection, that introspection is naturally linked to spirituality, spiritual practices, however you define them, because of course, I don't want to get down too deep into the rabbit hole of what that is. But perhaps a shorthand for that is a word that has come up several times already today. And in fact, one of the co-hosts, Ashley Scarlett, is part of that movement of bringing mindfulness into conservation. So obviously, I think mindfulness is becoming much more mainstream today and what it means. And I already mentioned a little bit about mindfulness from a very, very basic description. Is about observing ourselves, maybe from a detached point of view at every moment, and just noticing that, just noticing. So some of that is again linked to spiritual practices, like meditation is very related to mindfulness. Meditation is a wonderful tool that I practice regularly, for example. So it's basically paths for healing, for becoming more vulnerable and more authentic. And that takes great courage. So all those things combined, it's almost like naturally, if I want to heal myself, I need to adopt spiritual practices to be able to do that, because I have to draw from inner strength, and that inner strength has to do with linking with a connection to whatever you call it, some higher being, universal being, or whatever life driving force there is that we feel. So it's about an internal journey into becoming more integrated, better regulated from just from a nervous system kind of thing. And it's constantly ongoing, but to me is essential, and it's something that I have to work on every day.
Yeah. For me, the intersections of spirituality and my queer identity are very institutional, I feel like. I currently go to a Catholic private institution, and I went there for my undergraduate too. So that was kind of my first exposure to spirituality. I did not grow up in a religious household, so spirituality has always been on the back burner for me until it was in the forefront of my mind, because suddenly I was exposed to it. I was required to go to classes on theology and things like that. And it was just really interesting, the ideals that were taught, I guess, as queer people towards attitudes of us from, I guess, religious attitudes towards queer people what we're taught as queer people is that, you know, homophobia is rampant through institutional religion, especially Catholicism, just speaking personally, but the theology classes that I've taken here at USD have actually been some of the most eye-opening towards the intersection of religion and my queer identity for me. And granted, that was because I ended up taking an LGBTQ plus and Christianity class at USD, which really was eye-opening and just like allowed me to see a different perspective on how to view spirituality, especially in the context of Christianity and queer identities. I think that there's a lot of nuance when it comes to, as there would be in any situation, I guess. But like that overarching narrative of homophobia and demonization of queer people is real, but there's also a lot of nuance and context behind why that happens, I think, and a lot of different narratives. And I think it all comes down to how do we start to break down those barriers of institutional religion that we've been that have been kind of oppressing queer identities for hundreds of thousands of years. And, you know, I can't do that by myself, but I don't really know where I was going with this, but that's just my experience with spirituality and my queer identity, I guess.
Yeah, and just to add on to everything that was already said, I think that especially in science, one of the things that we can do is, or I guess this isn't even just in science, but I think a lot of us, especially like we said, almost all of us were raised under a cis heteronormative paradigm. So that's the assumptions that we often make about the world. All of us are doing the work to break down those assumptions, and that's really important. And part of that, I think, in mindfulness for me, is when somebody is sharing some part of their identity or sharing their experience, if you have you might have an instinct to interrupt or to interrogate that experience, don't. I think we're all a lot of us, especially those of us who are cisgender men, are, you know, sort of raised with that sort of as a thing that we do. We question things and we play devil's advocate and blah, blah, blah. Think if your instinct to respond to something like that is to question it or to interrogate it, instead just take a moment and just say, cool, thanks for sharing, and just continue to engage with that person as you were before, and learning to break down those behaviors that we've been sort of either allowed or encouraged by society to develop. That's a specific one that I think people do without even realizing it. Even people who I consider to be really supportive allies will sometimes they will catch themselves, or I'll catch them questioning an experience that I've had. And when that happens, it can be really demoralizing and it can totally shut down a conversation. And so just sort of trying to practice mindfulness to be like, why is this my instinct? I'm not going to do that, actually. Is one small specific example, but I think it makes a big difference in the way that we engage with each other, and learn about the other people that we work and live with. So.
Do either of the other panelists have anything else to add to this particular topic? Because if not, I have a couple of questions that kind of don't fit this one or the next one. So if they're okay. So we have two questions from Facebook Live, sort of related. The first one is there anything that funding bodies can do to help create or promote LGBTQ safe spaces?
For me, funding is like, I feel like any scientist you ask needs funding, honestly. But what I've found is most useful for funding is, you know, staffing. Finding people who will be mentors to those who are coming into academic institutions. And obviously I'm getting to that point where I mean, I've been in that point where I need mentors in my life to help me through academia in ways that a lot of my current professors can't, because they are cis white men and they don't really know my experiences that well. And so for me, that is like the most important aspect at my point in my career right now. But I know that there's like, you can do anything with money at this point, honestly. But Daniel, you might have better insight than me, honestly. Yeah.
I so appreciate what you said, Annabelle, because from my perspective, and I really appreciate this question about how funding agencies can help in creating safe spaces, is that for me, the trajectory that I've had is one where for decades in my profession, there was never any role model, any mentor, any of this sense that I could relate to other people, that I had to always pretend something other than who I was, that I was always assumed to be heteronormative, and always having to deal with uncomfortable questions about are you married, who's your girlfriend, who's your wife, whatever. So it's about better supporting the next generations, which means scholarships and support for, or fellowships and support for graduate students that come from minorities. So, I mean, that to me is just one of the most basic and most essential ways to help out with that. At the same time, I'm not going to deny, I really appreciate what you said, Annabelle, about supporting mentors, because I hadn't thought about that fact necessarily lately, but there is that, my own history of having that experience of not having anyone to whether a peer or a mentor to guide me. And that is just as valuable as being in a position to support a student that otherwise would not have that opportunity, or that would leave the field because they don't feel safe or understood or accepted.
Money and mentors, I agree.
And just to add on to that, I feel like a lot of scientists of color, a lot of queer scientists do a lot of the DEI work within academia, and a lot of that work is unpaid. So being able to compensate these folks who, do this unpaid emotional labor is so important, because like I said, we get exhausted, but I would get a little less exhausted if I were financially compensated.
So that actually leads right into our next topic. So I do have the other two questions, I promise. I will work them in to those of you who have asked. I have them saved. But there's high expectations of emotional and institutional labor from queer scientists. So that's our next topic. If anybody wants to start there.
I guess I can start
Actually,
with,
if you don't mind, I'm a little slow on the uptake here, but I did want to touch on what Annabelle said just a second ago, because I think that's something that it's coming up and it's important. And is the fact that a lot of organizations are getting on board with the DEI aspect. For instance, in my institution, all position descriptions require DEI participation, and granted, as part of the entire distribution of how my allocation of time is pretty small, but nevertheless, everyone's required to do this. But when we're talking about the fact that a lot of minorities, whether it's people of color or sexual minorities or whatever, are disproportionately asked to be in these committees and panels for DEI within your organization, that takes actually a lot more time commitment, and also a lot of emotional commitment. Annabelle touched on that, but it is huge because a lot of the times we are doing the heavy lifting for others. And yeah, we are tired of educating, standing up for ourselves, all of that. That is emotionally very taxing. And I think it's great that organizations all across are adopting this DEI principle and how to become more inclusive. But right now it's being done at the expense of minorities. And that's not compensated right now very much, or not very much valued. And I would say for us that do more of that work, for essentially what we're doing right here, that needs to be better supported financially. So, I'm sorry that I had to go back to the previous topic, but I do think that we're in a place where that work is currently not as valued as it should be.
Yeah, I definitely agree that our work, even though it's so important, I feel like people appreciate it, I don't feel like it's as like it's treated as such, just to put things into perspective, I am one of, I think, 4 trans or non-binary shark scientists that I know of. And of those, actually, he's not even a shark scientist anymore. So I am the only now. So 3 trans non-binary shark scientists. And out of the 3 of them who I know of, I am the only person of color amongst those 3 that I know of personally on Twitter. And so that means for me, a lot of people, when they think, oh, LGBTQ plus scientist in shark sciences, who's also a person of color, who can we ask to do this talk? It usually goes straight to me because I kind of check all those boxes. And, I don't want to be someone who just checks off boxes. I want to either, form a relationship with this organization and like have a relationship with this organization and do it out of like, because I'm passionate about this organization or because I'm financially compensated. I'm a grad student. I work a part-time job while I'm in grad school. So I'm taking time out of my day, already busy day, to give out free advice basically to those attending certain talks that I do. It's really hard to feel like this meant something to me personally, just spewing out my life story, my life experiences, advice for free without either having that relationship with that organization or getting financially paid for it, because it's basically another part-time job for me. And to have to, and for some people, and for sometimes me, certain experiences bring up trauma. They bring up like emotional turmoil that, I have to deal with past this talk, that audience members don't have to deal with past this talk. For them, they've gained something, but for me, I've lost something. So, being able to properly financially compensate your speakers who are speaking on experiences that are of marginalized identities is super important, in my opinion.
I completely agree with everything Annabelle and Daniel just said. And we're talking, I understand we're mostly talking at like the macro level of giving talks and going to conferences and sitting on committees, but there's also, I just want to raise the sort of daily expectation of emotional labor from queer people. And to do that, I'm just going to give a brief example where outside of my lab, in the biology building, there is a queer flag. And a couple of times in a row, it was defaced, or people wrote things on it after hours. So it was someone who had access to the building, not just like a random person walking around. And it was it's always the first thing I see when I come into work. And thankfully, the first time it happened, I was like in a good place and I saw it and I was just like, oh, like, and then just sort of went about and did my job. But over the course of that day, that day became about that defacement. And everybody was asking me if I was okay, how I felt, what I thought we should do about it. And over the course of the day, it really wore me down. And I appreciate that people care about me and they want to know that I'm okay and they want to know what I think that we should do. But I don't want that entire expectation to be on me because I'm the only queer person in my building. So there's a balance there where you want to make sure that someone's okay, but you also don't want to, yeah, exactly. It's re-traumatizing. So I was fine the first time I saw it, right? I had a great morning. I had my coffee. I was like, F you, whoever you are, I'm going to go do my job. And then over the course of the day, every time it got brought up, I was just like, okay, we're still talking about this. And then I went to happy hour and it was the topic of conversation at happy hour. Everyone's like, oh my God, who do you think did it? And like, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't want to talk about this. So this goes all the way from the macro scale of the expectation of our unpaid involvement in events and committees and panels, all the way down to just sort of little daily things like that. And so this takes us, again, I think back to mindfulness, where it's like, think about how you're going to engage with people. If something happens at work that you suspect affected a queer person, maybe just do what you can to handle it, and don't then go to them and be like, oh my God, look at this thing that I did. Like, I'm really glad you did that. Here's a gold star. You know what I mean? Like there shouldn't be, you don't then need to come and talk to us about it. We are really glad that you did that and you did a good thing. And my tone is tilting because I've now been talking about this for so long. I'm very sorry. This is not meant in an aggressive way. It's just, again, we're just touching on different ways that emotional and institutional labor is expected of us. And I think that that's important for people to hear who might not be aware. That's all I mean.
Yeah, and then briefly touching on two things that Zeke said. The first being allies who do a good thing and then come to tell us. Honestly, that is in itself exhausting. I've had people who were like, oh my God, this person that I told this story about you and this person who doesn't know you misgendered you. And so I said, hey, that's not their pronouns. And I'm like, great, but what does that add to the conversation? Like it doesn't. And like, I'm glad you're standing up for me when you're not around, but that's like the bare minimum. So you need to just keep doing that. Like, it's great, but you don't need to tell me about it, because I obviously expect that of you if you're my friend, and then the second thing that I had was something that you said at the end, which I'm suddenly blanking on. What did you say at the end? It had to do with...
About my tone.
Oh yeah, your tone. We don't need to sugarcoat things. We've been through years and years of oppression now with just in life and within the academic institution. And I honestly don't think that that we owe it to anyone to be nice or to beat around the bush about this topic of being inclusive and wanting to be in the same space as everyone else and making space for us, because it's not something that anyone should have to go through. And so, like, honestly, like, being harsh or being fed up or impatient about an issue is something that I feel very strongly about. And you know what? You can be mad. You should be mad.
So we do have a Facebook comment from a little while ago from the Facebook Live that says this is really helpful and informative, and thanks for doing this. So we do, at least in this small space, have a lot of appreciation for the panelists for doing this, because Ashley and I both also recognize that this is a lot, and emotionally this can be triggering and re-traumatizing. So we all really appreciate you guys doing this.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have one more topic left, but I'm gonna squeak in a question. So this was from a while back, again from the Facebook Live. So university HR departments have a bad reputation for protecting university reputation instead of victims of harassment. have you had any positive or negative experiences from university administration, and how can they do better?
Sure, I can jump in quickly with actually a very brief recent example. Yes, obviously an HR department primarily wants to maintain the reputation of the institution, as much as their charge is to advocate also for the employee. But I would say, because the question is about a positive and negative example, I do have a recent example that I consider positive, where there was an act of violence committed to a trans person in at our university town. It didn't happen in the university, it happened at a convenience store nearby. And the person who was the subject of the attack was not a student of the university, and the perpetrators, one of them had been a former student of the university, but was no longer a student. Nevertheless, obviously the act of violence got reported to the police, and it became the subject of an investigation. So anytime that there's that's one of the tricky things about this kind of situations, is when there's some level of brutality or something like that that involves the police, then it takes things to another level, where there's some level of you have to maintain certain things because of all the legalities, and you no longer can necessarily speak freely, or there's some level of things have to be under wraps while the investigation is completed, type thing. Nevertheless, the university made a pronouncement within a week of the event, officially condemning the event and offering their support and listing resources that were available for different levels, students, faculty, and so forth. And there was subsequent follow-up, and where the university was engaged in trying to provide help, as well as denouncing the event. So that's one situation where I feel, at least in my university, that was handled reasonably well, at least in terms of speaking up. A lot of the times is just merely like speak up, and speak up quick, as soon as the event happens, not about a sort of a reactionary response that happens later. Of course, yeah, when we're talking about in police investigations, that tends to slow everything down and make things challenging, but nevertheless, having a pronouncement denouncing things like this should happen soon, and should happen quickly, and even almost without a question by the university, because anytime there's one of these acts of violence, more than likely it truly is an act of hate, or a hate crime, or violence, and everyone's touched on some level, but especially the minority communities immediately. It just has this sort of repercussion throughout the community, and if you don't feel like the institution is offering the support quickly enough, it just kind of like lingers there and causes additional damage.
Yeah, I definitely agree that a lot of the times institutions take a lot of time to formulate a response to the to whatever happens, whatever harmful action has happened, and that unfortunately loses some of its impact because it's right after the wave of action that follows this whatever harmful action occurred. For me personally, in my undergrad I went to USD, and USD always harks on like, oh, we care about our undergrad students, student life is a huge deal for us, blah, 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 until it came to the donors and the money. Suddenly, being in the queer part of USD, we had a drag show every year, which took forever, first of all, to even get approved. And even at that, there were several limitations that came with it. So we weren't allowed to take pictures, take videos. We had security. there was like limited registration, blah, 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 because there was a group of donors who were very strongly against the drag show. And so USD had a bunch of internal conversations with the queer community, the leaders of the queer community that I was not a part of, but basically trying to compromise with them on ways that they could get the drag show to happen, but also still get money from their donors. And it's this really interesting relationship where, you know, you can tell that the admin wants to support the queer community, but at the same time, they care so much about the cash flow that comes in from these homophobic, transphobic donors that they really don't know what to do. And so it's really fascinating to watch that relationship unfold. And I would really like to see more proactive like action on USD's part to kind of finally stand up for the queer community, not just internally, but externally, like publicly, and be like, just finally put their foot down and be like, hey, you can't do this anymore. You can't have a petition denouncing the drag show every year. And you can't have protesters outside the theater every year praying the rosary. Like, that's not okay because it's threatening to our students. And we don't care how much money you give. But unfortunately, a lot of the times money does trump the well-being of the students.
Yeah, I think all of that's a really good point. And I think it all goes to sort of this unspoken point that has sort of been floating around this conversation, which is whenever it comes to sort of an institutional attempt to address some sort of bigotry, you have to make a very informed decision, and that decision is going to affect the marginalized people responsible. And so if you're going to take action in some way like that, the decision has to be informed and it has to be discussed with the people who are going to be affected, because every institution is different. Like Annabelle said, in a lot of places, money is king. And sometimes you end up with great situations like Daniel described, where you have an outcome that is to the desired goal, right? Like forwarding, making advancements, supporting marginalized people. And sometimes those people aren't believed, or their concerns are dismissed, or they're investigated and then dropped. I go to a very liberal school. I was at an undergrad in University of Maryland. It's right outside of DC. It's a very liberal area. I was subject of an assault, and my institution was basically like, we can't really do anything. There wasn't a camera nearby. You were in town. We can't prove, like, you say they said something, but they'll just say they didn't say it, or that there was a misunderstanding or whatever. So we can't address it in the way you want to address it. And the same thing happened to another friend of mine, another queer friend of mine. So at a different school, but in the same area. So you really have to make an informed decision, especially if you're going to do that on the behalf of a marginalized person. Like, you have to really think about it and collect your information. Don't just leap in because you think it's going to be for the best, right? I know that's a very sort of messy, complicated answer, but it's a messy and complicated subject. So just wanted to put that in there. Just inform yourself about what's going on and make sure you're involving the people who will be affected.
So I have a comment from Facebook Live that I'm going to read. So somebody said, so I guess this is talking, I think, about our last topic about emotional labor. I guess it's really a matter of empathy and being aware when much is too much, and really putting yourself in others' shoes. Bragging about good things you have done, well, in itself is a bit selfish and essentially doing the opposite of the initial intentions. I would say basically saying or bragging that you just defended or corrected someone else's pronoun is kind of the equivalent to charity tourism, where you give the water to the poor, put a photo on Facebook, and then go to your privileged life in your 5-star hotel. So I think our message here is getting across. Okay. Chris says, money does trump the well-being of students, and it's a very sad truth about universities today, unfortunately. Okay, so we have like 15-ish minutes left, so I'm gonna jump into the very last topic. So gender biases in publishing and presenting and invisibility of queer scientists is our next topic, our last topic.
I have a very recent example of this. I recently walked out on a paper about the inclusivity and diversity of marine sciences, like just in general. It was going to be a huge paper, I think. It was the first to kind of survey the demography of the marine science field and attitudes towards diversity and inclusion in the marine science field. So I was recruited on this paper as one of the 3 non-binary and trans shark scientists. And it became very clear to me that I was recruited onto this paper, not because I had anything academically to contribute to this paper, but because of my identities. And, you know, it was a benefit for me, and because I was basically not really doing much on this paper, but at the same time, I was getting my name onto a paper. And eventually there was a conversation that had happened in which the PI, who was a white gay man, asked me to lead the paper as kind of this signal of like, look at this diversity that we have. But also, oh, it would help propel your career as well, because, you know, it would be a first author paper. I don't have a first author paper out yet. And so I initially accepted this paper because it would only benefit me. And it got to a point where we had started the writing process, and the PI just randomly one day asked for the lead authorship back. And to him, it didn't seem like a big deal because, you know, it was contribution based, but we had already had this conversation with the other authors that behind the intention of putting me as the lead author. And so to me, what it felt like was that he had done all of this performative stuff, kind of, you know, doing all of this complicated performative stuff only to take it back. And even though I didn't deserve the lead authorship, it felt now that I was really being tokenized for my identity on this paper, because he didn't have the identities to, I guess, qualify writing this paper. And after some complications, all 3 of the other co-authors ended up leaving him with his data set, unfortunately. So I don't think that paper's ever going to get published, unfortunately. It's some really good work, really good results on there, but unfortunately it's just stuff like that happens. And a lot of the work of trans, queer, people of color in sciences either gets scrapped or goes uncredited because of situations not similar to this, but like adjacent to this, I would say.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something that comes up a lot, this ties very much into, like you mentioned, Heather, the institutional and emotional labor aspect of it, sometimes, often, as Annabelle just talked about, tokenization. But I think one of the things that we talked about, you know, if you're going to ask a person from a marginalized group to represent that marginalized group in some way on a panel, on a paper, on a committee for diversity and inclusion, those should be compensated. And then also on the other side is invite those same people to talk about their work that they're passionate about. Don't just invite us to talk about diversity, you know, engage with us as scientists as well. We're not just like stamp queer scientist, right? Like I describe myself as a queer scientist, and I am, but I'm also a scientist, and I love to talk about my work. I'm I love to tell stories about what my fish have been doing. I love to engage with science, with other people doing similar work. I mean, many of us like going to conferences and giving posters or giving talks and engaging with the community. And we want to do that too with science, right? And so I think that that's a really common pitfall people fall into, is they'll invite us to do talks about being queer, but they won't invite us to give talks about our science, which is something that is beginning to shift. And to peel back the curtain a little bit with this talk, with this panel, one of the original visions for this panel was that each of the panelists would be able to give a research talk leading up to this panel. And because of funding, which goes back to funding, being able to get funding for queer research and science, we weren't able to do that. And I apologize if I'm oversharing, but like, money is one of those things that can be a very difficult wall to break through. But that's the sort of vision for what, we want more of in the future, right? We want to be engaged as scientists as well as queer scientists. And so that's what that is. I don't know, Daniel, did you have something you'd like to add, or Annabelle, did you have a follow-up?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, this issue of gender disparity and visibility, yeah, there's a lot to be said, and it's a messy situation even outside of the consideration of gender and so forth. Just in terms of authorship, is always a little bit of a minefield, and prior identification of roles in a manuscript, a study, a paper, and sort of explicit authorship, and a lot of practices that are coming online these days about how to do this better certainly help. So there are some resources and some elements to be better about that overall, generally, sort of in the publishing world. But that said, I think the more underlying situation here is that there is also the aspect of the power differential and what it means for late career, mid-career, or early career scientists in terms of authorship in a paper, and where I am placed as an author in the paper based on my contributions and all kinds of external considerations that have to do with advancement in the field. So obviously in Annabelle's case, this being sort of jerked around from being the lead author to not, to yes, to no, and so forth, just sport practice on the PI, but at the same time, there's that power differential where, he felt that he could do this and just kind of like change his mind at will, not necessarily acknowledging the fact that for an early career scientist, the impact of something like that can be very different to a later career scientist that doesn't need so much the publication record and so forth. That's one aspect. The other aspect has to do with, and it maybe ties in a little bit with the funding consideration, in that the publication pipeline starts actually at the outset of the funding. And if we think about who are the best scientists, the most prominent and so forth, a lot of times that comes with privilege and with a lot of this was come up earlier about this sort of colonialist view of how science should be done and who has traditionally been doing science. So there's a section of the community, the science community, that essentially have been groomed to be kind of at the top in terms of they're the best scientists, they're doing the leading edge scientists, and of course they are attracting most of the funding. So from the funder's perspective, I think there should be a little bit of consideration of, just like when we do hiring practices, that we want to be more diverse. When they are thinking about giving funding, also consider not just who is the best scientist and perpetuate those who are traditionally heteronormative, but also include additional considerations in the award to promote queer scientists. So, because eventually that will lead down the publication pipeline. And where that has an impact is that where we are today, I am aware, and I know some queer scientists who are very advanced in their field, and they're excellent academics, but they're by far an exception rather than the rule. There's been very, very few scientists, queer scientists, have got to be leading edge at the top. So we have a lot of catching up to do in a way, and because of the history of where we come from and the multiple obstacles that we have had to overcome, perhaps we are not at the same level as someone who hasn't had any of those obstacles to, like any other minority, to overcome. So obviously there is a need for supporting a lot of the minorities, including queer communities, to be better funded, so that maybe not right now, but down the line, we will be at the top, but we'll be leading scientists. But that takes time and money to support that over a long time.
And then just one more thing, just regarding funding wise, a lot of times queer identities are not considered marginalized identities in a lot of grants or a lot of fellowships, which is really interesting. And then to layer that, a lot of the times Asian AAPI identities are not considered marginalized identities within STEM either, even though in my field personally, marine sciences, ecology, we are underrepresented. So I think systemically and institutionally, some revisions need to be done regarding who is considered underrepresented in STEM. And it needs to reflect who is actually underrepresented. And I'm not saying that because I think that the people who are underrepresented by definition of these entities don't deserve the money. I think that there just needs to be more mindfulness when it comes to writing out those guidelines and really listening to those who, like queer identities, who are underrepresented in STEM, and being like, oh, we should include them more explicitly in our guidelines so that they don't have to argue the case for themselves in their personal statements, for example, or their grants.
Okay, are there any last thoughts for people? I know we've been here for a while, so it's supposed to get tired. Okay, so I won't drag this out too much. So Ashley has put all of the Twitter tags for Zeke, Annabelle, and Daniel in the chat. If any of you have a website or something you want to boost here, you can go ahead and do that now, in addition to your Twitters. If this is a LinkedIn or a blog or anything. I know, Annabelle, you have a podcast.
Oh yeah, I am currently on hiatus, but all of my past podcast episodes are available to access on most streaming platforms. I can provide the link for that as well. But it's actually all in my link tree, which there's the hyperlink for that.
The podcast is bomb. If you enjoyed this panel, that backlog is excellent.
Yeah, like I said, I co-host it with an undergraduate from the University of Puerto Rico. I think he's trying to start it back up right now, but the most recent past ones, a lot of them are mine. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, maybe one thing I can say here, sort of in closing, is that this has been a really wonderful conversation that we touched on a lot of things, but in my own experience, it's even better if we have the ability to re-listen to a lot of these things. And that's how I learn better. So listening to things like podcasts, for example, has been really helpful to me in that these topics keep coming up again and again in the future. And over time, you kind of like get more in tune and get a better understanding. A lot of this is sort of incremental understanding of a lot of these issues, and it takes time. So, I would say just be patient with yourself, pace yourself, and absorb all this multi-layer complex situation over time, but with a commitment to maybe, listen to one podcast a week or something like that, where these things are discussed. And that usually is a better way of being more in tune with this kind of situation, that maybe just like once a year, oh, I'm going to like jam everything in 1-2 hours, and I'm kind of like the rest of the year, I'm kind of like tuned out of that world.
Okay. We have a very long message that I'm going to read from, Juliana. So this is in response to Annabelle's blurb. I cannot tell you how relatable and connected this discussion is for me. I appreciate the vulnerability and honesty. I know it's exhausting, and I thank you for your sacrifice. I work at an institution where I am the only biracial Asian and out employee until recently, and we are in a very small community. Our institution is based on research and science, which I conduct every day at work. We are now forming a DEAI committee, which of course I am a part of. But it has been so hard to articulate everything you've talked about here today. This will be so helpful. And I'm working on getting a sensitivity and humility training for our staff, which has been difficult. With the audience that we have and the work we do, this is very relatable, which will help promote connection and understanding. If you have any recommendations for this, their email address is in the chat, juliannak@alaskaclife.org. Thank you for your visibility today, and I hope to connect with any of you. Okay, so I have okay, so one of the things we have talked about today is funding. And so this particular panel was actually funded by the Society for Marine Mammalogy. And so this is the kind of thing that in order to proceed, getting funding like for these kinds of events is crucial. And so we want to see more of this in order to pay our panelists. Right, we want to pay people for their time, especially how we talked about emotional labor. So we want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. We know this is it's not just a normal like talk, you're giving emotions, you're being vulnerable. Some of this might be triggering, and so we really, really, really appreciate everything that you're doing here for us today. We want to thank everyone who joined us on both the Zoom and Facebook Live, because this is a very valuable conversation. If you think we need to have another event on this topic, please let Society for Marine Mammalogy know, and also Ashley Scarlett, who is our fearless leader in organizing this panel and several others. And we would love to hear your comments. And so there's a lot of links and such in the chat. And if anybody has any, sorry, I just got a note that the Office of the Naval Research was our funder through the Society for Marine Mammalogy, I believe is the way that worked. But it's really, I think we're really fortunate to be able to pay for this. And so we want more events like this. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley, for all your efforts to get this together. I think we had a nice run up into the preparation for this that really put us where we are today, and we were able to pull this stuff together thanks to your visioning and planning, and of course the support from Office of Naval Research and the Society for Marine Mammalogy for giving us this space. I think that this has been a wonderful space. I'd like to see more of these spaces happen more regularly.
The other thing is that I believe this is recorded and it's going to be put up on YouTube. So for anybody who missed, if anybody who you think would gain something from this who wasn't able to attend live, this is going to be up on YouTube eventually. Okay, is there anything else before we are free?
Thanks to all who attended.
Mm-hmm.
This was a really productive conversation. I actually learned a lot too from my fellow panelists. So I hope that everyone leaves today learning at least one thing, because I certainly learned a lot.
Yeah, if you're leaving here feeling energized, that is amazing. Take that energy into creating inclusive spaces like we talked about today. If you're leaving here feeling awkward or embarrassed or unsure, sit with that and use some mindfulness like we talked about to figure out how you can then take it forward. And I know all of you can help us all create an inclusive space. So again, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And thanks so much to everyone who helped set this up.